Good morning. We are live. Finally having problems with the laptop software. Locals, my web browser crashed and now nothing wants to work right. So for the folks at Locals and everywhere else, I'll just be recording this and then uploading it and sharing it there. But Facebook is live. Good old, unfortunately reliable Facebook. So we're going to continue on with King David. There's a lot going on with King David. Again, the salvation typology. And I said this the other day, David is not so much he's not really discussed as a type of Christ because but he absolutely is the precursor. He's the prototype, so to speak, to Jesus. And David is a type of Christ in that he's the first true king of Israel. Pardon me. He does come to be known as a man after God's own heart, which, if you watched the lesson a few weeks ago on his illegitimate child, you scratch your head going, this guy's a murderer and an adulterer, and he's a man after God's own heart. How does that work? But you see, actually, after that point, up to that point, he had been faithfully following God. After that point, he repents and gets himself right and continues to follow God all the way up until his death. I'd say he doesn't have problems. And of course, that sin carries on over into Solomon. And I'm just going to shut the laptop down. This stupid thing. I don't know. Don't know. Anyways, I'm wasting too much time this morning screwing with this stupid thing. But anyways, King David. Friday night was senior night. So went straight from work to the high school, and we did parking and sat through the game and all that, which we won, thankfully. If we win the next game, I guess we're supposed to end up in the first round of the playoffs. I don't know how we squeaked through that one, right?
Good Tigers.
And then yesterday was competition in Wetumpka.
Oh, Lord.
So I had to pull the trailer for that. And thankfully, there wasn't a lot of bands at that one. But, I mean, we still got back ended up getting home at almost midnight. So I'm tired. Anyways, that's no excuse. But back to King David. Well, when we left off last week, he had been anointed by Samuel. And of course, he's the least of these. And that's something, it's a theme throughout the Bible, is God takes the least and he does the most. Almost like the Marine Corps. Yeah. But he always takes the smallest, the least, the weakest, just the people you wouldn't expect. He takes them and he does great things. And I mean, you see that with every person he picks. There's something righteous about him. There's something God looks into their life as a whole and says, that's the guy I want to do X, Y, and Z. In this case, David is the youngest of his brothers, and he is looked down upon by his brothers. Like I said, similar to Joseph. And he's also the shortest. He didn't get to be tall like his brothers. And so and that's an interesting contrast, because like he goes up, we're going to talk about Goliath, right? And Goliath is like 9+ feet tall. And here's David, barely 5'8", I guess, maybe 5'6", 5'7", average, whatever the average height is for the Middle Easterner. And that's still even true today, 2,000 years later. And actually, at this point, almost 3,000 years later from King David. But just God will take the most unlikely people and do the greatest things through them. Moses had a speech impediment and speaking problem. and he used him to lead the people out of Egypt and up to the promised land. Like I said, Joseph was the youngest of his brothers. It wasn't the youngest because he had a baby brother below him. But again, he was the favored kid. Nobody liked him. He was looked down upon by his brothers, and so God took him and did great things through him to save the nation of Israel, right? So we're 700 years after that. We're at King David. And when his brothers were actually up, when they went to war against the Philistines, and his brothers were up there to battle, the whole nation of Israel was afraid of Goliath. And a little out of order for my notes, but that's okay. But anyways, let's see here. 1 Samuel 17, verse 37. So David goes to check on his brothers. If you watch the VeggieTales stuff, he was bringing them pizza. But he was, and that's what you did back then, is your family supported you in battle. They sent you food, and they sent you. It wasn't like our military today where we have traveling kitchens and traveling food supplies. So families back then would help and send food for their sons and their relatives that were fighting. So 1 Samuel 17, verse 37, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So what they used to do back then was to, instead of slaughtering whole armies wholesale, they would pick the strongest fighter from each army, and they would go out and fight each other, and whoever won, that determined the war, that determined the battle. So, and that way they only lost one soldier. And so the Philistines sent out Goliath, who, like I said, he was at least 9 foot tall, if not bigger. And he's sitting there making fun of them and taunting them, and they're all scared. And this is where you have King Saul, who is not the legitimate king. Now, maybe calling him a temporary king might be a better term, because God did allow him to be called, and he did put his spirit upon him in order for him to lead the Israelites. But he was only temporary because this is the leader that the people chose. This isn't the leader God chose for the people. And so because of his failed leadership, the whole nation is fearful, and the whole nation is sitting there cowering because they don't have a strong leader. They could have defeated, all they do is call upon God. They could have defeated the Philistines like that. So the Philistines were a constant, ongoing problem because the people of Israel did not look to God and obey God specifically to defeat that enemy. And so 17 verse 45. So then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defied." So if you remember, he picks up smooth stones, puts them in a sling, and he only uses one, but I've heard a number of theories as to why he picked up like 5. Supposedly Goliath had brothers, and he would have needed more stones in case his brothers came out there, but that's not the way it worked. I don't know. I really don't know why he picked up 5 stones, and he only ended up having to use 1. But the point is, he was relying on God, and it goes back to his time as a shepherd. And God, again, uses shepherds all throughout the Bible, and we have this constant imagery of being of God, of Christ, and of David, and these guys, Moses, Noah, not so much Noah, but Abraham became a shepherd when he went out, and that became the family business, and those became the Israelites. And uh, when Moses ran from Egypt, he went out and became a shepherd. And so here's King David. He was a shepherd. He gets anointed. He goes back to being a shepherd because he hasn't become king yet. And so he goes back to being a shepherd. Then he gets sent to go check on his brothers. And so here's Goliath taunting everybody. And this is what David is talking about, is the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear. So these animals would come and take the sheep from his flock, and he would go and rescue them. So here's this little guy, 5 foot nothing, and he's going up against Goliath, who's 9 foot whatever. Yeah, I mean, you're instantly thinking that he's going to lose just because he's smaller. But again, it's his time as a shepherd in defending his flocks. He's able to defeat Goliath, and between all that experience, faith and trust in God, and the knowledge he's gained in how to use a sling. And we think of slingshots, big rubber band things, maybe with a Y-shaped stick and a little piece of leather, and you're shooting marbles or ball bearings or rocks, whatever you can get your hands on. It was a little patch of leather with some string, and you'd sling it around and spin it real fast. And there was a way to spin it real fast and let it go. And it's very similar to shooting a bullet. It's not quite the same velocity, but it's enough to do damage. And obviously, in this case, the rock embeds itself in Goliath's forehead, and he dies. The part that none of the kids' stories tell you about is David then goes and takes Goliath's sword and cuts his head off. And he's bragging about this major victory, and he's got Goliath's head in a bag in one hand and Goliath's giant sword in another hand. And that leads to some weird stuff before David becomes king. But again, it's this major victory because he relied on the Lord and trusted in God. But let's see here. We go back to Ezekiel. And again, David started as a shepherd before he became king. Christ calls himself the Good Shepherd frequently. And he is king, but he will eventually sit on a throne as king here on earth to fulfill promises and prophecy and stuff that needs to be done before the millennial reign happens. But if you go back to Ezekiel 34, and Ezekiel was a prophet that was around about 400 years after David. He was a prophet during the time when they were exiled into Babylon. So Ezekiel was there for Babylonian captivity. And he gives us this prophecy in Ezekiel 34, verses 22 through 24. I will rescue my flock. They shall no longer be prey. I will judge between sheep and sheep. And I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd, and I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them. I am the Lord, I have spoken. So, something I mentioned last week is with the prophetic terminology, one of the phrases they use to talk about Christ, or the Messiah, is he would be the son of David. And you see that with these guys in the gospel. Son of David, have mercy on me. Son of David, have mercy on me. Again, it's a prophetic term. And so people were realizing that this was Christ. This was the Christ. This was Jesus of Nazareth, the one who was prophesied. But Ezekiel lived almost 400 years after David, and he was prophesying about not just the coming of the Christ, of the Messiah, but the actual millennial reign. So he was prophesying about something nearly 3,000, 2,500 plus years later. And he keeps saying, David will do this and David will do that. Obviously, David's not going to live forever, and we're not cloning David. They weren't doing that back then. So who's the David? And again, David is that prototype king. He is the greatest king for the nation of Israel. There was one guy later in years, right before the Babylonian captivity, who was like the second best king to David. He's the one who came closest to actually being like the David, but again, not the Messiah. David was not the Messiah. And so Christ will be the ultimate fulfillment, the better king, the better David, the one true king. And there's arguments and discussion over like world leadership right now, and well, God put them in power. I have trouble reconciling that. Now, I will say God allowed these people to take power. God allowed these people to be voted into office because just as the Israelites were seeking after a king in the flesh, so to speak, and they wanted someone tall and handsome like King Saul, they didn't want to listen to God for leadership. They wanted to go on their own ways and do their own thing, really, so they could elevate themselves or to indulge in their own pleasures, whatever sinful issues are going on there. And so our politics across the world reflect that attitude, that mentality of we're going to do it our way, God, and we don't need you because we've got our own king, kind of a thought process. But David is the one that God chose to lead his people. If we look at the Gospel of John, this is Christ is actually speaking in chapter 10, verse 11. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. So he's, of course, prophesying that he's going to sacrifice himself. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. And that's, if you know anything about sheep, herds at all, animals really, dogs included. Your dogs know your voice. If you're a shepherd, your sheep know your voice. So you can go over to countries and go to places where the shepherds still actually walk around and hang out with their flocks, and you find out real quick that they know who their shepherd is. They're used to them. They know their voice. They know that they're safe with them. So that's a very real thing. But you go down to verse 16, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. So Christ is prophesying about Gentiles being brought into the family, being brought into grafted in, as to use biblical language, to be grafted into the vine with the Israelites. So it's not just going to be the Israelites who at the time were not listening to his voice, but then he's going to call in these other sheep who are going to listen to his voice. So that's the Gentiles, that's the church age, that's where we are today. And the Israelites en masse are still not listening to God. That's why they're having so many problems. So be praying for them that they'll get right with God. I mean, God's going to keep his promises. And so the Palestinians will be defeated. But, it's an interesting thing going on right now. It's an interesting time for sure. Whoa. Turn that back around. So.
10:40.
Yeah. All right. But again, it's the shepherd motif. Keeping a flock of animals does help you to learn to be a good leader to some extent. You become more conscious, more conscientious perhaps of others' needs. And we tend to get very selfish, and you can have leadership that's good leadership and getting the job done, but they're only focused on their part and their needs. Whereas when you're a shepherd, you have to look out for your sheep. The sheep get lost, you got to go out and find them, right? Well, did Christ say that you go out and rescue the one and the 99 are safe, so you go and find that one that's off by itself, that's in danger? As David said, when the bears or the lions or the wolves or whoever would come, and he would have to go rescue that sheep from whatever animal, whatever critters trying to eat it. An interesting thing with sheep, if you don't shear them on a regular basis to get their wool, Their wool grows so thick and so heavy they will actually fall over and they flip upside down. And if you take them and you stand them straight up, they'll die. You cannot stand them straight up. You have to massage their legs. You have to like lay them over on their side and massage their legs for a period of time before they're able to stand up properly. And then they can get back to doing other sheepy things until you can shear them or do whatever you got to do. But if you find a sheep that's upside down, don't stand them back up on their feet because they will die. It's kind of a weird thing. But the point is the shepherd has to pay specific attention to that one sheep and has to massage their legs and help them. And if you actually go look here in Psalm 78, verse 70 through 72, he chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds, from following the nursing ewes. He brought him to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with a skillful hand. So he was following around the ewe lambs. Why? To make sure that the new lambs being born were properly taken care of and they would be able to survive. So shepherding a flock, not that I have any experience whatsoever being around sheep. The closest I've ever come to that was when I was in the Middle East and we would moor up on the pier in Bahrain in the Persian Gulf, and like half a mile away was this massive sheep carrier. It was a ship that they would transport sheep from one end of the Persian Gulf to the other. Sometimes you get on the interstate and you've got these cattle cars, these 18-wheelers with the cattle trailers, similar kind of thing. Maybe you see the chickens in the little cages going to the processing plant. They have like this massive ship that is a sheep carrier, and you get downwind of that when the wind would shift, and boy, it stunk to high heaven. Ooh. One of the things I shared with the kids at my last church when I was doing children's churches is King David had fleas, and God still used him even though he had fleas from hanging out with the sheep. So that's but the point is that's why God uses shepherds to do everything. That's why Christ is the good shepherd. Obviously, David had problems. He was not the Messiah, could not be the Messiah. And, he's not a perfect person at all. As you read in the time so when he kills Goliath, he then is basically almost made a general. He's given a squad of soldiers to lead for King Saul, and Saul, of course, the Spirit has left him, and the Spirit is with David. And this is something Mike Winger points out is, like Christ is baptized, receives the Holy Spirit, but it's this very quiet thing. And that marks the beginning of his ministry. And his movement towards the throne, his movement towards becoming king, officially king, even though he is the king, he's not in that position yet, is this kind of quiet, drawn out thing. Of course, we call this the church age. But if you go back and look at David is anointed in private. That's what we talked about last week. He's anointed in private, in secret. So King Saul knows nothing about it. And of course, the Spirit leaves Saul, goes on to David. And the people begin to realize, as you read through, as David has all these military conquests and stuff, people begin to realize that the Spirit is no longer with King Saul, the Spirit's actually with David. And so they begin to really follow him. And nobody's going to depose the king because that's the guy that God said should be king. So at least in that regard, they had enough respect for God that they weren't going to mess with the man he chose. Obviously, like I said, he's temporary. David wouldn't even kill him. Every chance he got, he wouldn't even kill Saul because that was the anointed one to lead Israel at that time, and it wasn't his time yet. But David goes through some weird stuff trying to understand and have patience and wait for the Lord. So he goes off on all these weird, acts crazy. He actually sides with some of Israel's enemies, not to attack Israel itself, but to help them with their other enemies. And he goes out and fights wars for them and saves them. So again, that's kind of that salvation for others before, because Israel, he was being rejected by Saul, who was quote unquote Israel, so to speak. And so in him running from Saul, with God being with him, he was able to save these Gentile nations through their battles and stuff. Again, not that they were going against Israel, because David would not have gone against his own nation. But he's actually out there fighting for these Gentile nations, these pagan nations, and they're surviving. And so that's that salvation picture of, Christ bringing salvation to the Gentiles. The Jews reject him and the Gentiles accept him, which is what Christ said would happen there in John 10:16. So, you get that picture as you go through David's life. And let's see here. 47. All right, so we'll start to wrap this up. Hopefully next week everything will work out technology-wise. And but we'll pick up on David as king of Israel. And we should be able to finish this up before we move on to the next thing. I may break off and I have to look this up to see the exact Greek enunciation, but it's Didache, Didash, or Didache, or Didache, or Dudade, or something. I don't know. But it's an actual, and I've talked about this before. I finally got the books. It's a very small book. It was a short scroll that really amounts to the first century, first commentary. It's not canon. It's not part of the Bible. It probably was not written by any of the apostles. It would have been written by some of their disciples, but it was a kind of a short and sweet summation of, almost like we have the Baptist Faith and Message. It would have been very similar to that. And so I've got a copy of that includes the original Greek. And so we get through David. I think I might spend a couple of Sundays going through that. Eventually, once I get done with the salvation typology stuff, I'm going to move into, and we'll go through the book of Hebrews. A lot of good theology there. We'll kind of go over some more of this typology stuff, although that's more specific individual stuff. It's not like big picture salvation typology, as I call it. But that's what's coming up in the coming weeks. And of course, we've got Fall Festival next weekend. Thanksgiving is coming up not too long after that. Of course, Christmas. So check church calendars. Lots of stuff going on all over the place. If you don't have a place to go and fellowship, find one. Come and check us out. I'm here every Sunday unless I'm filling in somewhere else. But we got plenty of good, faithful folks here. But find a church to fellowship with. Don't be that one sheep by yourself out there in the wilderness in danger that the shepherd has to leave the 99 and come looking for you. Find your way back to the flock with everyone else. So, that being said, go out and make disciples. Have a blessed Sunday, and I will see you next time.